One of the things that I like to do is to make Paul strange through archaeology, putting him in a context where the ancient city, ancient life, the ancient worlds that he's living and moving and having his being in, all of a sudden look surprising, look different than we expected. And when we put Paul there, all of a sudden we can imagine Paul in a different way. When I walk through sites, I often think about a chapter by a French philosopher and historian named Michel de Certeau, and it's called Walking in the City. And he talks about one way to understand and see New York City is to take the elevators from the ground floor up to the very, very top floor and to stand on the top and overlook the entire city. In one moment, you can see Central Park, Midtown, Meatpacking, all these different places. And you gain this sort of almost seductive, totalizing knowledge. But what he points out is that kind of knowledge is not the kind of knowledge that any real New Yorker has, or at least uses on a daily basis. If you want to understand New York like a New Yorker, he says you need to take the elevator down, go to the ground floor and walk out into Chinatown and look around and see and smell and touch and taste and feel and use all your senses to get a sense of what New York is like for real New Yorkers in their everyday life. You begin to see these ancient ruins and you begin to look at how life would have worked, and you realize their access to food was different. The way they did basic stuff like wash their bodies or go to the bathroom, or the way the communities were organized, they're totally different. And for me, that became exciting. There's just a lot of things we can't know for certain about the ancient world. But that doesn't mean we should say, I don't know. Sometimes what you can do is to take all the sources, to use that to construct a historically grounded, imagined picture of what would have happened. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And a lot of ancient historians love to point to this line and use that phrase for describing why it's worthwhile to think about the past in a historical way. When we look at archaeology, it takes people like the Apostle Paul, who we feel, whether we've studied him our whole life or just heard about him, that we feel, oh, I already know what he's about. So as you can see, we're in Cleveland, Ohio right now. Just kidding, we're in Athens. Down here is the ancient Agora, right over there is the Roman Agora, and where we're standing here is the Areopagus. This is the place where Ares was said to have been tried for murder of Poseidon's son. Paul doesn't talk about this place in his letters, but after his life, we get a source called the Acts of the Apostles that talks about him coming up to the Areopagus and giving a speech. Paul was here in 50, sometime around there, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the places that he was and the places that he wrote to. And we're gonna look at the archaeology that he was around or that surrounded the people that he wrote to. And we're gonna ask questions about who he was and try to unthink this overdetermined picture of Paul. We're right in the middle of the Agora of Athens, in the middle of the city of Athens, this major metropolis. And I love this site for thinking about archaeology and modern worlds and this combination of these rocks that are simultaneously so ancient and yet a part of modern life. And this site is really interesting because humans have just been living and moving and having their lives in this space for a very long time. And what I love about being among the ruins is it always pushes me to think about these people that have been sort of made to be bigger than life, to be whitewashed, to be made to look perfect or demonized in various ways. And it pushes me to think about them in real human ways. It makes me think of Paul walking through here as a kind of tourist, just like all these other people are kind of walking through here as tourists. He just happens to be here in the year, let's say around 50 AD. And by that time, it's already an old, sort of conservative, established university town where knowledge is valued and taught. And he's moving through here, he's looking at these buildings. Some of these probably would have been in ruins by his own time.
I have to say, I pity Paul for coming to Athens because he's showing up at Athens at the point where there's so many famous philosophical schools and personalities, and people from all over the Mediterranean are coming to Athens to train, both in terms of philosophy, but actually in rhetoric. When he comes here, there is a reason why he goes first to the synagogue and to the market. He's shopping around for ideas and understanding his competition. So he's going into the most crowded places to hear how people are talking and what it is that they're saying. So then he's ready to make his speech. And he says, he references in his speech very specific things that are Athenian specific. So he's shopping around ideas and he's trying to create a very local context for a message which is universal.
He's a normal guy living in a real world, and he's writing what would have been the equivalent of like modern day emails, right? And he's kind of shooting them out to this place and this place. They just happen to have been collected through the work of the church over time into what we now call the New Testament. But archaeology helps me, and I think helps my students, move back to imagine a world. And it's important, if you want to understand the theology of Paul, to understand that process, to go back to the beginning of this kind of material imagination, and from there begin to move through time and think about his theology.
We tend to a little bit separate the written record from the material record, but these people are not writing separately from their daily lives. So they might be talking about very high ideas, but these high ideas, there's a way that you create an identity, you create a way of thinking, and objects and buildings and spaces are part of that creation.
I think I'm less interested in the theology of Paul as like where he would have gotten a haircut and the shoes he would have worn.
Yeah. Well, look, he's referring very specific buildings.
There are 3 places, really, that give us some good data about his autobiography, where he's speaking about his own history from his own first-person point of view. And that would be the 3rd chapter of his letter to the Philippians, and then part of his, what we call 2 Corinthians, and then the first 2 chapters of his letter to the Galatians. And from that, we can construct a basic timeline of his life that probably, if we take the crucifixion happening in the year 30, then probably somewhere around 31, he has this, what he calls an apocalyptic experience, where he's just walking and boom, there's this experience that he has with the risen Christ. He actually says that Christ was apocalyptically revealed in me. After that happened, he does not go to Jerusalem. He does not go to Antioch. He doesn't appeal to any human authority. He goes straight to Arabia. So we think of Paul kind of having this experience somewhere in Damascus, kind of Syria, and then going boom, and he goes to Rome, and eventually he's going to make it to Spain. But actually, he says he does the opposite for 3 years. So from 31 to 34, he's in Arabia. And he obviously faces some kind of opposition. We know that because he writes that later the local authority hears that he's in Damascus and has the whole city put into a lockdown to try to arrest him, and he has to escape out the window undercover. And so he must have had some kind of experience in Arabia where people years later are still being like, who's here? Paul? Shut the city down. We got to find him. You know? So he faces opposition and maybe not too much success in Arabia. But can you imagine what would have happened if he had found success? And he was like, well, I'll just continue east. Like the entire history of the human race from the last 2,000 years would really look quite different. When I walk through places and I see, for instance, examples of like Roman houses that his communities would have met in, or examples of roads that Paul might have walked down, or cities that he might have moved through, what becomes clear to me is we're dealing with someone who the Romans thought was basically a nuisance, a menace to society. The kind of non-Jewish Greek-speaking community basically thought he was a fool, an idiot. The Jews thought he was a huge problem that needed to be eliminated, and he made, frankly, most of the other Christ believers, or what we would call Christians, nervous. And they actively went out to oppose him. Paul's own words about himself are, of course, important, but when we say things like, What if Paul was kind of a weird person, a marginal person? We're actually speaking from the perspective of people in Corinth, or Ephesus, or Thessaloniki. And what we're going to do is use archaeology to construct everyday life perceptions and ideas, so what you'd call social and cultural history, to imagine how they might have reacted to this traveling Eastern religious specialist who's telling them that the end of this age, as we know it, is right around the corner. So how are we going to go about this? I mean, first and foremost, we're going to be walking through archaeological sites. We're going to look at archaeological artifacts and ruins and remains, and we're going to ask what they tell us about the worlds that Paul moved through, and even more specifically, about what we can tell about how people in the cities that he's writing to and visiting, how they might have perceived him. Essentially, what we're going to do is 1/3 my own research and thinking on Paul and archaeology, 1/3 cutting-edge research from other scholars in the field who I think are doing really good work, and 1/3 sort of stuff that I couldn't publish in an academic, double-blind, peer-reviewed journal because I can't prove it. But we can use a historically disciplined imagination to think about what is plausible, right? And what I'll try to do is always mark, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's a what if. Because that what if is actually really important for us as modern people to reimagine pictures of Paul, to kind of come up with fresh imaginations about who Paul was and what he was like. For the most part, we're looking at a guy who was it was him against the world, and he was an outsider. He was unusual. He had ideas that few people shared, and he felt unbelievably passionate about them because he believed he had been drawn up into the heavens and received them apocalyptically from the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And so we're going to go from here to Thessaloniki, to Philippi, to Delphi, to Corinth, to Ephesus. And these are the kind of questions we're going to be asked, like, what kind of a guy was Paul? When we use this historically disciplined imagination, we can cross-reference it with Paul's letters, with this later source about Paul, to create this sort of webbed picture that actually looks really, to me, refreshingly different and exciting.